Today, I'm going to be discussing ivory throughout the Middle Ages, specifically the trade of ivory and the issues that come with that. I'm looking to explore how this material was sourced as well as the trade and commissioning of ivory works of art. Through my research, I want to answer the question, what was the life cycle of ivory in 14th century Europe and Africa? My sacred object that I focused on for this is called the Booklet with Scenes of the Passion. This is a booklet thought to be from France and dated to the early 14th century. This booklet was carved from ivory, and about 10 to 20 years later, designs, which will be seen on the next slide, were painted into the booklet. These types of booklets were used as devotional prayer books throughout Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries. This image shows one of the pages of the booklet with Scenes of the Passion. As noted earlier, the painting was added in about 10 to 20 years after the booklet was carved. I believe that this is important to note for the reason that there are images within this book that are only painted, meaning this object once had a different meaning when it was simply ivory. Take note of the quatrefoils on each page as well as Mary's halo. This is the back cover of the booklet. I find this page very interesting again because of what was added to this booklet by painting onto the ivory. The holes in Christ's hands have faint specks of red as well as the wound in his torso. I think this is interesting because it draws attention to it as well as highlighting Christ's humanity as well as divinity. This is another example of an ivory devotional piece. This type of piece would have been commonly placed upon altars for worship. I want to know how a tusk from an elephant came to be an intricate and meaningful religious item such as this. So let's start with the beginning of the ivory's life cycle, the elephant. Trade records indicate that the ivory used in art during this time period initially came from walrus tusk and was in some instances just animal bone, which doesn't contain any ivory at all. It wasn't until the mid-13th century, around 1240, when the trade of elephant ivory was documented between Europe and Africa, and thus the boom of elephant ivory trade began. However, there's little to no explanation as to why there was a sudden boom of the supply and trade of elephant tusks. Scientists were actually able to determine that the ivory supplied to Europe throughout the Middle Ages came from the African savanna elephant. They were able to do this by measuring singular pieces of ivory from France during this time period and comparing that to the size of elephants and their relative tusk sizes during this time period. It was through this that they discovered that tusks of the African forest elephant and the Asian elephant are far too small, and that the ivory that was used must have been sourced from the African savanna elephant. Ivory was incredibly expensive, and one small sculpture could cost a middle-class person an entire year's salary. Historians believe that this is due to the extensiveness of the trading itself of ivory. Ivory was sourced out of the southeastern part of Africa, which was then shipped up towards Egypt through the Red Sea. From there, tradesmen traveled through the Mediterranean and up the western coast of Europe before docking in England or northern France. This journey was long. It was just around 9,500 miles, which would explain the massive price tag. It is also believed that the Bible is cause for ivory to be such an expensive product, where it references that King Solomon has an ivory throne. Additionally, Genesis chapter 2, verses 10 through 14 could be interpreted by some that goods that are transported by ship out of Africa come from the Garden of Eden itself. Although religious context aids in our understanding today of the prices of ivory, it was more so the extent of the trade route and the rarity of ivory that caused the high price of the material during these times. So who bought this ivory? Much like other commissioned works of art during this time, the patron of the work bought the materials to supply to the craftsman or sculptor, or they provided the craftsman with the funds to purchase the ivory. There is little documentation of how much a completed ivory sculpture cost compared to the cost of the material. But with some math and records of other art commissioned during this time period in Europe, it is estimated that about 55% of the final cost of the work is for purchasing of the ivory alone. To sum up, the entire life cycle of ivory, it was sourced from Africa's savanna elephants, placed on ships, sent 9,500 miles through 2 seas and 2 oceans to reach Europe, where wealthy merchants purchased ivory to then commission a craftsman with the job of sculpting the ivory into an object, most typically a Christian devotional object.